In its just released January 4th, 2024 World Economic Situation and Prospects Report, the United Nations has warned that global growth was slow to 2.4% in 2024 from 2.7% in 2023, significantly below the pre-COVID pandemic trend of 3%. The warning comes as leading central banks continue to deploy the high interest rates they believe necessary to combat inflation. We track the 7 largest countries in the world, which comprise 61% of global GDP, so we shouldn't be surprised that the weighted average GDP growth of these big 7 tracks closely to global GDP, since they account for most of it. In other words, as goes the GDP growth of the big 7, so goes the GDP growth of the world. Given that, let's compare post-pandemic GDP trends of the big 7 from 2023 to the present to the pre-pandemic trends of 2018 and 2019 to get a sense of what has happened. Economic growth for Britain, France, and Germany has slowed substantially, from 1.4% to 0.7% in Britain, from 2.0% to 0.7% in France, and from 0.8% to negative 0.3% in Germany. In Japan and India, the story is the opposite. Japan's has improved from 0.05% to 2.1%, and in India improved from 5.6% to 7.2%. China, which continues to underperform expectations, has declined from 6.3% to 5.3%. Lastly, we have the U.S., which, in stark contrast to Europe and in sharp defiance of expectations, has slightly improved from 2.3% to 2.5%. What accounts for these results? I'm going to suggest that increased interest rates are a very big part of the story. Recall that central banks believe that higher interest rates have been necessary to quell inflation, even though a number of analysts, including we here at Tychos, have debunked that. But one thing high interest rates have definitely done is curb growth. We see that dramatically in Britain, France, and Germany, where interest rates are now a whopping 3 to 4 percentage points higher now than in December of 2019, just before the pandemic, and are clobbering growth. Note that these charts show interest rates for 10-year bonds, but the story would be essentially the same if we used the rates for 3-month bills instead. Contrast that to Japan and India, whose central bankers have courageously resisted the call for dramatically higher rates, and rates have gone up by comparatively very little. Then, of course, you have the extraordinary and completely different situation in China, where they have overbuilt in real estate, with reputedly as many as 100 million empty dwellings. Here, interest rates have actually come down slightly to try to ameliorate the stranglehold high levels of debt have on so many of its companies. But when you have far too much real estate, lower rates don't really help restore demand all that much, as we saw in the U.S. in 2009. And lastly, we have the surprisingly positive story in the U.S., where, like in Europe, we've seen rates increase dramatically, but unlike in Europe, growth has held up. We attribute that to 2 absolutely key things. First, the U.S. had the boldest approach to countering the pandemic, especially with very strong government programs, and that brought good momentum that continues. Second, the U.S. is significantly underbuilt in the massive residential real estate market, with a shortage of over 1 million homes, which means the need for new residential construction will counteract much of any economic softness from other sources. Not having enough of something like housing, though it is usually lamented in the press, is almost always good news for future GDP growth, because the need to build or produce more to fill a deficiency boosts GDP growth. The parallel to that is that having too much of something is almost always bad news for future GDP growth because you have to slow down production until demand catches up with supply. So there you have it. The global slowdown in growth can be attributed in no small part to high interest rates. If central bankers are truly concerned about the implications of the UN prediction, they should start easing interest rates now. Thanks.